Good evening.
Hello all, we are Conscious Isolation in collaboration with the University of East London. We've had this last semester to have a very interesting lecture series so far, and today we are graced with a great lecture again. I'm going to hand over to Emma here to introduce our lecturer for today.
Hi there. I'm really delighted this evening to have Faisal Abdu'Allah do a talk for us. On a personal level, he's a really good friend, mentor, and a brilliant artist. He was also my key tutor when I was at UEL 20 years ago. I'm going to hand over to him, and at the end, we will do as many questions as you would like. If you have questions in between, there's a Q&A live chat on the side. I will be manning that all the way through the talk. Please put your questions up there. I will relay those to Faisal, and he will answer them. Good evening, Faisal.
Good evening. Can you hear me well?
Can, absolutely.
Perfect. I just want to thank Sam for making the offer. Thanks to Isolation for convening this and giving me this opportunity. I want to thank Emma also for assisting, putting this together. And good to see some old faces, Craig and Dan. So yeah, I guess I'll start, shall I? All right.
Go for it, Faisal.
Okay, so I don't know where to start. Okay, so my parents came to the UK in around 1967, and one of the seminal moments for that was we go back to 1948. Everyone talks about this moment called the Windrush moment, where a number of people came from the British Commonwealth countries. So Jamaica, Barbados, St. Lucia. There was a ship called Windrush that sailed to all of these countries in the Caribbean and offered these individuals an opportunity to come to the UK to work because it was short on labour. My parents came 20 odd years later, and they would always say they came by aeroplane. The important thing to emphasize here is that, growing up in London, I was born in London in '69, a few years later, was that, living and growing, you tend to find that you live in two lives. So my parents in the home would teach us all the traditions and the cultures about, the Jamaican tradition that I didn't know about because obviously I was born in the UK. And then we'd be primed for when we're leaving the home. This is how you function when you go to school. So, W.E.B. Du Bois talks about double consciousness. And for me, that was something that I experienced very early. So growing up in London, that's me, the smallest one there. These are my siblings. And I guess growing up, I realized that one of the ways that I could create space, we lived all in the same home, and it was quite tight at the time. The way I could create space was by drawing. So I did a lot of drawings and did a lot of collage work, did a lot of painting, just as an outlet. And I guess as a way to kind of just imagine. And I think that was the greatest thing that I always had, was the capacity just to kind of think beyond the physical space that I was living in. And when I was growing up, I was surrounded by a number of images and a number of what I would call events. So when I, as a young kid, I would be woken up by a noise at maybe sometimes 2 o'clock in the morning. I'd go out onto the landing and I'd hear my dad speaking in this language I never kind of understood. And then it turns out he was speaking in tongues because he could see spirits. So my dad was a minister, and he would talk a lot to these pictures in the home, And as a young person growing up, you assume that the person that has a similar identity to the picture that you have on your wall, that your father speaks to, that your father almost worships, you somehow bequeath the same kind of respect to people that you see in the physical world. So I went to school and I befriended a kid that looked exactly like this guy in the picture because, you know, my dad said he's a savior to mankind. So I thought, if the world's going to end, I'm sitting next to my school friend, Ian Kent. He's got blonde hair, he's got blue eyes. When the fire and brimstone comes, I'm going to be saved. So again, you know, you can imagine how images, you know, factor into how you know, your own kind of existence. But also growing up in the UK, you know, you're bombarded with a number of images that you see in popular culture. And I always say, you know, artists are the shapers of social consciousness, and things that we see that are represented, artists have helped augment that. So the way in which the world, you know, mediates and understands me, it's purely by what they've seen in movies, what they see on billboards, what they see on magazine covers. And, you know, the one on the bottom left is really symbolic, because I remember 3 years after leaving the Royal College, I was invited to this discussion called 10 Stories About Photography. And I shared a platform with Oliver Toscani, the guy who did the Benetton advert, Alan Sekula. I mean, it was an amazing panel. And I was this young kid, just out of art school. But what's really important is, if you look at the different images that we see here, you know, about representation, you can ask yourself the question, has anything really changed? So for me, you know, the idea of constantly being authentic, and I try to tell students, I try to tell artists this, and when we have conversations, I think, you know, the strongest work comes from authentic spaces. And I guess for me, as a young person growing up in London, you know, I felt that there was some disconnect with the way things were being represented and what I kind of understood about myself. So as I became more curious, making work, and, you know, starting to go to exhibitions and going into shows in the National Portrait Gallery and seeing paintings of the black body in turmoil, you know, being impaled in paintings, you know, then my art teacher began to show me works by other artists that looked like me. So I began to see works by people like, you know, Eddie Chambers, Donald Rodney. This is a seminal work because it's made with Donald Rodney's skin, you know, made from his skin, and also some of the things that we see in popular culture. So I began to understand that the Oscar, the symbol of the Oscar, was based on an Egyptian artifact. I think Emma has a question. Is that right?
Yeah, hi, Faisal. There's a question that's come through, which is, what was it like being black amongst all East End in the 80s?
Amongst what, sorry?
Amongst all of East End skinheads in the 80s.
Oh, wow. Really, really good question. I mean, what I would say was that when I was growing up, we were always told that there are the skinheads and the teddy boys. And my father spoke about the skinheads and the teddy boys. So we would have a family member who would drive us around. And I would always see them from a distance. So I would always see them in the car, and there was a glass that separated us from them. And because I lived in West London, which is primarily a big Irish community and a big West Indian community in the 70s, so there was a lot of, you know, community spirit. So the Irish community and the West Indian community felt they had a common oppressor. So the skinhead and the teddy boy presence wasn't as prolific in West London, Ladbroke Grove, as much as it was on the East End or in the south or southeast of London. So my engagement was, you know, I think there was maybe 2 incidents where people said, hey, there's some skinheads down, you know, Kensal Rise making up some noise, and we cycled down there on our bicycles. When we got there, they'd already gone. So my father had interactions with them in the late 60s, early 70s. So when they were walking home from the factory work, what they were always advised to was walk in numbers. So they would walk in groups of 10 and 11. And a lot of the documentaries that you see, they talked about the Jamaican guys with the bicycle chains and the flick knives. They were the ones who were bringing the fight to the teddy boys and bringing the fight to the skinheads. And in West London, there's a place called, I think it's Penny Steps in Ladbroke Grove. And that was a very famous bridge that crosses a canal from the Harrow Road onto the back of Ladbroke Grove. And that's where the Teddy Boys would always congregate every evening, waiting for the young men to come in from work, and they would fight them on that bridge. So my contact was very minimal. My father would always tell me stories every Sunday at the dining table about his fights with the Teddy Boys and skinheads. Nice question. So for me, again, this idea of searching for authentic memories and looking for ways that you can self-identify. I came across these images in a show called Black Chronicles, and these were images like taken in 1891 of African communities that came to the UK in the Victorian era. And for me, what I find really quite problematic as a practitioner was, if you think about the way representation functions, in that you always see the body in turmoil, or you see a body that's impaled. You very rarely see images of joy, of people being thoughtful. And I felt that these images were extremely light years ahead of its time. And for me, one of my most favorite images were an image of these two boys, Albert Jonas, and just having this very beautiful moment, just taking a picture, having a care for nothing else in the world. And I think it's really important to understand that I'm not trying to gloss over, the history of the black body in popular culture, but it's important to understand the highs and lows, or the peaks and troughs, or the complexities in which that body exists, which is not necessarily afforded to it by so-called dominant society. So as I'm searching for this authentic memories, I'm creating all of this work. As I started art school, Central St. Martin's in 1989, I started as Paul Anthony Duffus. Yeah, I started with a completely different name. And for me, I was asking myself those very difficult questions. What does Duffus actually, what's the name mean? And I found out Duffus was a Scottish name. And what I found out was that I went to America as an exchange student at Central St. Martin's, and I was exposed to the Harlem Renaissance. I was exposed to practitioners, writers, poets, and I was a young 19-year-old kid and didn't realize that actually there were a number of makers creating content, creating imagery through the Black experience, the Black lived experience. So that then gave me a certain level of confidence and a rationale as to why I needed to kind of do this. So this drawing was a way of, this was a therapeutical drawing as I was making that journey from Paul Anthony Duffus to a state of, for me, full consciousness. And then my name was changed to Faisal Abdu'Allah. And as I made those work, that transformation, I made these screen prints when I came back from the US to start my third year at Central St. Martin's. And I started that third year as Faisal Abdu'Allah. And my professors were like, what the hell is going on here? And I created these screen prints, and I utilized the color as being symbolic. Blood was, the red was for the blood shed, the green is for the promised land, and the yellow was representing prosperity or gold. And I did these series of screen prints that were more like drawings. So I was half loading the squeegee and pulling it across, and there was an immediacy of the process that was creating this indelible mark that couldn't be repeated. So it was me working with print in a very kind of a painterly way. And then I left the St. Martin's and went straight to the Royal College of Art and continued this journey, this kind of intellectual and spiritual journey. And I created this work called Thalatha Haq, Three Truths. And it was the way in which I made this transition from works on paper to works on materials, because I began to be really intrigued as I was doing etchings, as I was making lithographs. I was looking at the stone with far more detail than I was looking at the actual image on the paper. I was pulling copper plate etchings, you know, in the print room with Norman Ackroyd, and being much more, you know, in awe of the plate itself. So for me, I began to think that the material carried some kind of memory, carried some kind of purpose, and began to think about how I could make almost like a self-portrait that looked at my transformation from Paul Anthony Duffus to Faisal Abdu'Allah. And it was a very fragile moment for me. And the BBC made a documentary about it, and it was called The Day That Changed My Life. And this piece ended up being a triptych screen printed onto glass, and it's me standing in 3 positions of prayer. And it was photographed in Spain when I did the exchange. So for me, traveling was a way in which I was able to think outside of the constraints of being in London. It gave me a sense of freedom. It gave me a sense of kind of liberty. And in some ways, it was a way of resetting the hard drive. And this piece was shown at my first year show at the Royal College of Art. And what happened was it was actually collected by the V&A. So I only had it for 3 weeks or 4 weeks when I created the work. And then it was acquired by the Victoria and Albert Museum. And this is when I began to think about the idea of a kind of materiality, looking at faith and the unseen in this piece. And then as I was coming up to graduation, I was thinking about my final year show at the Royal College of Art. And I thought I wanted to look at the idea of my body through the lens of popular culture, but also through the lens of some of my friends that were living in my area. And 5 of my friends, they put together this group called Scientists of Sound. And I was curious to create a body of work that was almost kind of like life-size, that was almost physical in its kind of presence, but referenced some of the elements that they were felt they aligned with. So they were listening to a lot of American conscious rap by, you know, KRS-One, Lakeem Shabazz, Tribe Called Quest, and they were trying to invest that into their own work. And I was curious about the whole bravado of how they were dressing, and in some ways, some of the dialect they were kind of incorporating into their everyday lives. And also there was this conscious shift happening amongst young Black British people in the UK in the late 80s, early 90s, where they were dropping their European names and embracing more Afrocentric names. So there's a generation of men and women and people who are gender neutral, who now have different names to what they had, you know, 20, 25 years ago. So there was a huge kind of shift. So I was listening to this song by Ice Cube called I Wanna Kill Sam Because He Ain't My Motherfucking Uncle. And I was curious about the idea that Ice Cube was referencing that there were these young African Americans who went to war to fight for their country, for its liberty. And when they came back, they didn't have any kind of support, or they weren't even acknowledged by the government and its authorities. And in that song, he said, if you see a man in red, white, and blue being chased by the lynch mob crew, it's a man who deserves a buckle. I want to kill Sam because he ain't my motherfucking uncle. And for me, I could see these kind of images of this guy running down the street, Uncle Sam, with his like hat and red, white, and blue trousers, being chased by the so-called lynch mob. And that's the name of Ice Cube's rap group at the time. And then I decided to invite my friends into the Royal College, and we did this photo shoot. And you know, the weapons that they are holding, they were fake. They were just almost like mimicking a lot of the album covers that they would see. And this shoot had something like, you know, probably like 120 photographs. And what I did was I gave them curatorial access to select one image that they felt represented them. And then these images were screen printed onto steel. And they were 2 meters by 1 meter. And they were pixelated. So as you got closer to the image almost became abstracted. So the images became consumed in a way by their own abstraction. And I got a lot of critique for this, that I had, pushed race relations back. These were negative images of black men. Why are they holding guns? They're urban gangsters, And I raised the question about, what about images of 007? What about images of Sylvester Stallone? 007 is sexually promiscuous and kills a lot of people, but nobody ever questions that dark side of 007. So for me, it was about the idea of how do we begin to, reset the hard drive of how we look at bodies. And then this is the piece that I made close to the end of my final year at Royal College, and it's a screen print onto steel. And as you get up close, you can see the words "fuck the police." They were etched into the steel. And then on top of that, it was screen printed with this kind of hooded figure. And this piece spoke directly to the incident with Rodney King. So as you can see, born and raised in London, felt in a sense of connectivity with the American experience, listening to rap music, referencing the way in which they were utilizing rap as a divisive tool to kind of talk about social issues, and they were young. So it wasn't like me listening to the Temptations or listening to, Curtis Mayfield, where I'm listening to somebody who's probably the same age as my father, but I'm listening to people who are the same age as me, who are out there on MTV and talking about, a very important contemporary social problem. And after I made the Sam series, I made the Revelation series, which was looked at the politics of the Black Christ, and continued and made a piece that talked about, the Revelation, the Last Supper. And as you can see, the Revelation series spoke directly back to those images of Christ that was in my house that I viewed, from the age of 5 till 15 or 16. And again, it was revisiting this very popular moment and populating it with this, with the people that were in my Sam series, because they're still there, but they're wearing their robes when they're in their spiritual element. So it's not a staged image. Every person in that image is actually wearing, what they wear when they went to the mosque at the time. And then I shot Last Supper 2, which was actually, what they would wear, when they would be in their kind of, in their work mode. So there was a work and there was a spiritual mode. And there were two different approaches to the way in which the optics played out in this image. This one where they look directly at you, you're being summoned. And the other one is it's almost as if there's an event that you actually, they don't know you're there. So again, the idea of how we see, the idea that some people can look in and be invisible, and others where, you feel under a different, you're invited under different conditions. And I think the way in which we see and the way in which we receive information is something that I'm really kind of always been conscious and curious about. And you'll see me explore that later on. I think everyone's got a question.
Faisal, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a question from Brian Ford, who's an MA student. He says, referring to 007's darker side, did you enjoy the characterization of Joker? And then he says, brilliant film.
Oh, that's a great question. And it's funny because I was watching the Joker the other day again, because I believe that there are so many elements within the character of the Joker that not necessarily align themselves with me, but the idea of this, malevolent being. And for me, there's that seminal moment, I feel, when they said they were questioning the Joker, and they said that some people just like chaos. They just love chaos. And for me, I would say that the reason why I make my work is that my work comes out of a kind of orderly chaos that has been constructed by, where I was born. I mean, I came into the UK, and I think there was a certain amount of, I would say, conscious architecture that augmented a certain kind of perception. So the best way I can do that is that when I was critiqued for having these images of these young men holding weapons, and we find those images threatening, I would say, well, why don't we go to the National Portrait Gallery and let's take a walk around and look at some of these generals on horses, you know, decapitating people. And let's have a look at some of these saints being impaled. So for me, the idea of people using weapons as a form of, you know, through the lens of war or through the lens of conflict, it's not unusual. It's just that the society then try to say that, well, certain people are permitted to do this and others are not. And the ones who we don't want to permit them using it, we're going to see them as kind of outliers. We're going to see them as people who are, you know, you could say evil or not worthy. Well, that's a very good question.
Brian wanted to add that he saw it 3 times. Just showing.
He's got 2 up on me.
I've seen it twice myself.
And for me, I think this format for the talk, I was saying to Emma, is really important, that I'm not just talking head all the way through. I think it's important that people can stop and puncture the moment and just say, hey, I've got this kind of idea, can you speak to it? So please feel free to, you know, to ask or suggest or make a comment, because I think the silliest question is one that's never asked. And, you know, I would hope that there are artists out there who are thinking of having a career in the arts and they're not sure. And I was there 20-something years ago, and 20-something years later, I'm still doing it. I haven't done anything else but make art and created a complete life through that. And it's, you know, and would I do it all again? Absolutely. So
I think that's really important what Faisal said, that, you know, this is an interactive experience and you guys should add your questions to it. Just keep putting them up there and I'll forward them. Okay.
And this is a project I did called Heads of State. And I'm going to come back to Heads of State a little later, but I'll just tell you about the medium. It's actually screen prints, and they're pasted onto the wall. So they never exist as a physical. They're always scraped away. And essentially the reason why, they're actually photographs of bodies in a morgue, and they're pasted onto the wall. And it was looking at the idea of mortality, because at the time I was creating this work, I was actually working part-time in a barber shop whilst I was doing my master's. And I think there was a period of about 2 years where every month or every 2 months, one of my customers had died. So one of them had been shot, or not one of them had been shot, but most of them had passed through being shot through some kind of altercation in West London. And I just felt there was this pattern, there was this spirit that was, you know, kind of lurking, taking the lives of these kind of young men. And Heads of State was a piece that kind of spoke to that. So it was one of the pieces where I was working with the senses. So when this work was put together, the gallery had to drop the temperature, so it was almost like the fridge. When I went to the morgue to take this picture, I asked the mortician if I could get a gallon of the liquid that they used to mop the floor. So the gallery was mopped every day with I think they call it phenolic liquid, which is what they use to clean the morgue with. And I used to play in the background the Gregorian song from the Oxford Choir. So you come in and there was this total experience of smell, of sound, of temperature for this piece. And this is one of the objects that was in that show, a screen print onto glass coffin. And Heads of State was that, you know, the first time I was actually working and thinking about space. And, you know, some years later, I began to think more about my body as an object and a vehicle of, or almost like how would I describe it? A talisman that held all of this kind of data. So what you see here is a drawing done by the architect David Ajay. We were at the Royal College together. And what you see there, it's a box within a box. And it's hard for me to describe it because I'm not sure if you can see can you see my mouse? Yep, okay. So basically, you would come into the gallery here. This was installed in the Chisenhall Gallery. You'd come into the gallery here, and there'd be a person standing here. And they would look at you, and they would say, if your eyes are blue, gray, or green, or brown. If your eyes are brown and red, you had to walk along here, into this space here, and into this room. And in this room, you saw this box. If your eyes are blue, gray, or green, you have to go this way, along here, and walk inside the box. Each space only had one way in and one way out. So as you walk down the space, if you were brown-eyed, you'd walk down this dark corridor, and you would see this box, and people were inside the box. So if you were brown-eyed, you're walking down the corridor, and you see this box. If you're blue, gray, or green-eyed, you have to put on these padded shoes, and you're inside the box. And in that box has a red steel floor, and it has red glass around it. And on the top is a steel ceiling, so it's totally reflective. So you see yourself in a multiplicity. And on the floor, there's an etched text from the Matrix, where it talks about the blue pill and the red pill. But the thing is, this box is made of spyglass. So those people who are inside have no idea people on the outside are looking in at them. So the idea that these people are in the space saying, oh, this is wonderful, this place is, I can see myself in these multiple identities to the point of infinity, but that's all I know. And then the brown eyes are coming in and seeing this beautiful glowing box with people inside they cannot get into, but they always know what's going on. So the idea of the Garden of Eden was looking at the idea of privileged spaces, privileged gaze, that there are sections of our community who know what's going on. They're woke, they know what's going on. And there are other areas within our community who are completely oblivious or choose to be oblivious. Was there a question now?
Okay, so I have here a question which I've asked if we could rephrase it, but it's about how you I guess read a facial expression when we take a picture or make a video.
Oh.
You're like, oh.
So is it when I take it or when I look at somebody else's?
I guess how you frame that.
I mean, for me,
it's about facial expression and how we capture that, I think.
So, I think we can maybe answer that a bit later, but actually, no, we can answer it right now.
Okay, go on.
So as you can see, Alchemy and Circles of Loyalty, this looks at my my Goldfinger series. So if you think about the Wanna Kill Sam series, and you think about what some of the ideas I was playing with, the bravado, the playfulness, the veneer, the fiction that these people were gangsters, they weren't. This whole notion of the theater. And I decided to look at the idea of British badness. How would somebody find out or do some research or look at British badness and the Circle of Loyalty? And I contacted the British Mafia. So this guy on the far left with the slashes in his eyebrows, I did those eyebrows for him. His name is Mitch Pyle. His father was the late Joey Pyle, who was the best man at the Craze wedding. So what you see here are some of the artifacts in the show: knuckle duster, gold-plated, and a fake gold-plated Beretta that looks at the different layers of contact when people carry out these kind of acts of violence. But what's more important was these pieces were a series of portraits that I took over 3 years. So on the left is Freddie Foreman, on the right is Alan D. But what's more important is the material is brass that is plated with 3 microns of 24 karat gold. And then the images are then screen printed on top. So I'll just run through these. And again, if you think about the expression, so for me, they were almost emotionless. There was no smile, there was no grimace, there was actually nothing. It's almost like catching that person as they finished a sentence or as they were about to start a sentence. So for me, it was very, very important to really try to empty out my subjects for the work. And what I've noticed throughout a lot of the work that I've created, none of my subjects are smiling. And it's very rare that their mouths are open. I do like to have them in a very kind of neutral stance. So all the muscles are almost like relaxed. So the one on the left is Roy Shaw. They called him Pretty Boy Roy Shaw. And when I was photographing him at his house, he kept grimacing and putting up his hands because he was a bare knuckle boxing fighter. And Mitch Pyle had to go to him and whisper in his ear and said, Roy, no, you don't have to do that, Roy. Just pose. And after, I think it was 7 or 8 shots, Roy just kind of emptied himself out totally, and I was able to get the shot. And on the left is Joe Jr., Mitch Pyle's son. Again, on the right is Mitch Pyle and Roy. So, was there a question?
Yes. Hi. Why do you think that working class people, and this actually is quite interesting question in context of our conversation prior to this talk, why do you think working class people generally don't go to art galleries?
Good question. I don't have the answer to that, but I can say it's for me, it was my parents didn't go. So because my parents didn't go, it wasn't something that they felt was of any value to me or to them. Because when they were in Jamaica, you know, my parents, you know, were living, I would say they were more in a much more kind of suburban area. And I do know when I think about my kids now, they go to galleries, they know all about galleries simply because of what I passed on to them. I think, you know, there are a number of reasons why working class people would not go, because I don't think they see themselves in it. I also think that, you know, people that have more means have more time. So you generally find that, you know, people that come from families that are more comfortable, they are able to have more leisure time. So a working class person works. You know, they wake up and they work from sun up till sundown. And I can honestly say when I was growing up, my father and mother, they just worked, and all they wanted to do was to ensure that we had a certain quality of life. Now, because my siblings now have created a better life and are now more time rich, so now they are more time rich, and they can probably then do other things. So they can go to the theatre, so they can go to galleries. So I think that it's a number of things. I think one, it's to do with the means. I think 2, it's about being aware, and I think 3, it's about whether you see it of having any kind of value. Is there another one there?
Yeah, there's so your old colleague, good friend, and Professor Grenville Davey is asking about micro expressions in your portraits.
Wow. Hello, Grenville. Good to hear from you. And I think the students need to understand how fortunate they are to have you at the university. So he said, was it micro?
Micro expressions, and I've got a few things for you after this before you move on as well.
Micro expressions. You know what? I have never.
He's talking about in portraiture. I think he's talking about with the portraiture kind of discussion. about the micro expressions. So when you were discussing the fact that hardly ever do they smile, or it's about the micro expressions, the very kind of minimal kind of signifiers that we give away in portraiture.
Sure. Yeah, and for me, yeah, I get it now. So for me, the micro expression is for me, it's a way of opening a door, and I think that sometimes if somebody is winking or is smiling, or if their mouth is open, what I do, I think that creates a veneer that makes the work far more harder to access. So because I try to empty them of any kind of emotional kind of baggage, as I was getting the work created and sending it to print houses to make the films, to have things printed, everybody in each of the production places recognized one of the people in the work. Because I didn't realize how the East End Mafia was very much linked to the print publication industry, through pornography, through so many different things, but a lot of them had worked for them in different fields. But also, it was very important for me to kind of disarm them. So by having very, very little kind of expression was a way in which I felt, anyone could access it. Because what was happening was some of the production houses, they were asking me, are these professors? Are these writers? Are these critics? So for me, it was interesting that I was able to do that by trying to strip them of any kind of, I would say, personality. Is there a few more?
Yeah, no, that okay. So there's one here from Anonymous, which says, I might be being cheeky here, but is there a romance with the gangster?
Is there a romance?
There's a few more after this, by the way, Faiz.
Okay, well, I might move on a little more, but I mean, I don't think there's a romance. I think my personal belief is that human beings are disagreeable. Their nature is to be disagreeable, and I think that we find it hard in doing good. I think we're kind of almost like taught to be, this is the right thing you need to do over here. But left to our own devices, I think we're disagreeable by nature. And I don't think that the Goldfinger series was talking about, the malevolence of these people. It was more talking about redemption. So what I was saying is that when I was critiqued for, again, for, celebrating violence, I was like, no, think about the work philosophically. It's a non-precious material, brass. It has a thin layer, 3 microns of 24-karat gold. And then their images sit on top of this thing. And then I spent 4 years, going to their homes, going to their clubs, going to the restaurants to understand them. They turned around and said to me, you're family. So any problems you have, you come see us. And I would say, no, I go to the police if I've got a problem. But the important thing was, in our conversations, they talked about the regret that they had in their lives of hurting people, of taking things away from people, causing people to lose their life. And for me, that was a redemptive quality that I thought was kind of unseen. And that transformation for me was from a non-precious kind of way of seeing the world to a precious way of seeing, by having that level of forgiveness, having the capacity to understand that, you know what, if I did it all again, I would do it differently. And that for me was what Goldfinger was actually trying to tell the story of. And when people see the work, they see the show, they look at the text written by academics, they actually understand, oh, it's not kind of this knucklehead artist making a work glorifying violence. He's actually thinking about the idea how people, through alchemy, the idea of transformation actually factors into transformation of people's character and how they can potentially be a better version of themselves.
Just to respond to that very kind of briefly, I think that the main thing when I saw that exhibition was not that it was about a romanticizing of the gangster image. It was more that the culture that we live in romanticizes the gangster image, and so that was almost a reflection back to the society that we live within.
Okay. So again, a piece I did when I made my trip to the US. So I was invited to be a visiting professor at Stanford. And this is where I began to, understand a little bit more about the art school and the teaching structure within the US and the conditions and the climate of students in the US. And I had an exhibition, solo exhibition at Stanford Walton Gallery. And I taught one class for a semester in 2010. And whilst I was in my studio, there were these two students having a conversation, and it's almost like a light came on. I don't know if it was a shaft of light coming through the window, or it was the way they were sitting and framed by the wall, but there was this really beautiful, tender moment that was happening just in this conversation. And then they left. And because Stanford is a big campus, I called them like half an hour later because something was pushing me. And I asked them, could they come back to the studio? And they came back, and I asked them, you two seem very close, but who are the other people in your life who you trust implicitly? So the idea of trust, the idea of circles of loyalty that was in Goldfinger in 2007, 3 years later, I'm still thinking about the idea of this community and this idea of social practice. And they both gave me a name. So what I said to them was, can I take your picture under the tree at, I think it was 4:01, it's just before the golden hour. And they said, sure. So I took their picture and I said, can you tell each one of the people that you trusted to come and see me at any time this week or next week? And then they did. And then what happened was I would then ask that person the same question. And that chain of inquiry went on for 3 months. And then what it did was I ended up creating this work. So what you see here is the image on the left is the person that I photographed, and then the image on their very left is the person that they trusted implicitly. And as you see how the piece progresses, each person to their left is the person they trusted implicitly. And this was photographed at different points. But the important thing, again, materially, was that each line was printed on one piece. So the top line is one roll printed in one moment. I didn't want them as separate elements. And the bottom line is the same thing. And this image was 30 feet long. And it's structured, it's built on a curve. So when you stand in the center of the work, it occupies your scope of vision. And it was called At Eve, 10 degrees of separation. And then I think some of you may have seen this. This was a show that I had in London 2 years ago, and it was called The Duppy Conqueror. And essentially, the show starts with my heads of state piece, and it has to the right you see the tapestries. And what I did was in 2012 I remade the Last Suppers. So I used images that were never used in the original work. So something I need to tell you as artists is that you might create a body of work, a series of images, and you may not use all of them. I think in film they call it the director's cut, the part of a movie that didn't make the final table cutting room. And if you ever watched Get Out, there's two endings of it. There's one ending where he goes to jail, and there's the other ending where he actually gets in the car and his friend drives him home. And the latter was the ending that they went for. So for me, the curator, Barbara Martinez Ruiz, asked me, are there any images from The Last Supper that you did not use in 1996? And I said, yeah, there's loads of images that we shot in film. And he selected these two and offered to have them stitched as tapestries. And for me, this was a very symbolic moment because it was a way in which I could add a bookend and finally resolve what that period in 1989, that period of Black consciousness in the UK really, really meant. And the way in which I could use material, I could use a way of weaving, a way of making this indelible way of working that couldn't be torn. It was this, and it had its, and the earliest tapestries were actually made in Egypt. So for me, my fascination with kind of the history of Egypt and how I could self-identify with a number of the thinkers and makers who were there. And the fact that I was able to incorporate or reimagine the piece that I created, 10 years ago into this series of pieces, A Last Supper 1 and A Last Supper 2. Again, each one was slightly different to the previous works that I created. And they were huge. So the figures were almost life-size. So as you're standing in front of it, you felt as if you could actually walk in and occupy the frame. And also within that show, I showcased the first time my piece called The Duppy Conqueror. And Duppy Conqueror is a triptych. It's a self-portrait of me, and it's the masked alter ego, and it's a shapeshifter. And for me, it was really important that the Duppy Conqueror came into existence, because it was almost I would say the Duppy Conqueror is the person that has been making my work for the last 20 plus years. And the Duppy Conqueror travels through time and space. And it was driven and inspired by the Duppy Conqueror by Bob Marley. So in the song Duppy Conqueror by Bob Marley, he says in one of the lines is that if you are a bullbucker, then I am a Duppy Conqueror. So for me, the bullbucker is a term that I interpreted as that the bullbucker is a very physical thing, to be able to conquer this large physical animal. But he said, you can conquer the big, strong physical animal, but I can conquer the spiritual one, because the Duppy is something that is described through, African tradition as a disagreeable spirit. So for me, the Duppy Conqueror conquers spiritual things as opposed to physical things. So that's why for me, the Duppy Conqueror was on a higher level of consciousness by looking at the things that are intangible that it seeks to kind of address. Was there a question there, Emma?
Yes. Okay, so there's from Anonymous, so I'm not quite sure who this is, but it says, is it okay to nick that photography idea off you? And I responded by which one? They responded with the portrait photographs of people in a continuous line that they trusted.
Absolutely. I have no problem with that. I mean, life is a series of samples. I'm sampling, the speeches of Malcolm X. I'm sampling KRS-One. I'm sampling Lakeem Shabazz. I'm sampling, the way in which things are constructed. So life is a series of remixes, and and I always give reference them within the work. I never say that I am unique and I've done this all on my own. I always say I speak to where some of the ideas came from. So I have no problem with that.
Okay, so Faiz, there's another message here from our dear friend and colleague and great artist Amanda Francis.
Oh,
yeah, exactly.
Again, they're very fortunate to have Amanda Francis. Again, I can't speak more to being at UEL. I mean, I can say that whilst I was there in my part-time capacity, I had offers from so many other universities, and I stayed at UEL because that is fundamentally where, for me, you get the real authentic practitioners, where you get real authentic, teaching. When Tim Allen was there, he would bring in all the artists that he taught under the YBA to open up the degree shows. I mean, it was a spot, and it still is. So, just understand, I'll tell the students, please, please, please use the lecturers that are there. They're a great resource. Sorry, what's Amanda's question?
No worries. So Amanda says, I saw the tapestries of your early work, Last Supper, in two spaces, one at Autograph and the other one in a show much closer proximity. Which did you prefer? I think she's like saying here.
Oh. can say I did like the autograph setting, and I think the reason why it wasn't because of the way the works were, curated. It was more about the building, the fact that there was this building that was designed by David, David Ajay, and it was designed as a space to house and celebrate, artists from the kind of diaspora. And for me, I walked on that land when it was just dirt, and it was just kind of an idea. And I was speaking with Stuart Hall, and myself, Isaac Julian, Yinka Shoni Bear, we were on a committee that were, put together to help speak to the funders to try and get the money for the building. So, as artists, we were just saying it's important that you support the arts, because when you support the arts, you're supporting critical thinkers and and so on and so forth, problem solvers, and you're contributing to culture. But back to the question, I just felt that for me it was almost completing the circle of David's vision about what a space kind of embodies, the idea of thinking about material, space, light, history, memory, and then having this kind of Duppy Conqueror that has been walking with me all that time. And having Duppy Conqueror being unveiled in this particular show, in this location, for me was a real kind of seminal moment. So for me, having the Last Suppers sit in that space with the Duppy Conqueror, it felt as if it was a way again of, I would say, completely, not necessarily bringing closure, but I would say bringing completion to that kind of idea that I had.
So Faiz, the anonymous person who asked about if they could steal your idea, they've responded by, and I'm not sure who they are, if they want to tell us, that would be great. It says, Faisal is a legend, love his work. And then I've got a question for you from Alexis. So Alexis, head of fine art, our good mate, great painter. He says, Faisal, your work is such an intimacy with materials, the way you allow the process and the ideas to join and then create tension, often a political one, but one that includes the viewer. How do you create that balance between idea and process? Can you give me a formula?
Wow. Formula. I think for me, and it's funny enough, Alexis, I've referenced your work so many times to students when we talk about the way in which we think about the body, and we think about kind of movement and intimacy, and the idea that you create these surfaces, these skin surfaces that when they dry and you peel them off, and sometimes, you piss the gallery off because it stains the floor, but it leaves this index. So for me, I would say the way in which the intimacy is created is thinking about the work through a kind of a bodily experience. And when I think about that, I look at maybe how the subjects see themselves and how that sense of self can be reflected back into the world, because that's partly in the way in which I looked at kind of Duppy Conqueror. And you have to think about your work not existing in a bubble. If you think about the relationship between kind of history, violence, and these kind of uneven threads of knowledge. And for me, the Duppy Conqueror and the tapestries are able to then weave them together. And once they're weaved together, I just feel in their existence, then they become signposts. They then become these points of reference and potentially points of access. So when you see the Last Suppers and they have that physical presence, they feel as if they're a porthole that's open and you can climb into. It's about creating this thing that is bodily in its existence as well as relevant in its purpose. So that's how I kind of look at that question. I mean, it's a great question. That's a thesis question. And then within that show, I had this piece called After Kossuth, which was based around the chair made by Kossuth. And the interesting thing about this work, it played with this kind of the idea of the power of three, the power of three being a universal, represents birth, life, and death. And what you see here is a photo of me, a drawing of me, and a bust plated in 24 karat gold, made at UEL, actually. I made that piece in UEL. And it was Cy Satsford who wrapped the bandages around my head, and Mark Sowden. And they knew that I suffer from claustrophobia. So Cy had to hold my hand while they were wrapping this bandages around my head. But the important thing about this piece was that it looked at the kind of different ways of representation and how one navigates shape-shifting representation. And you think about after Kossuth, the Kossuth chair is a photo of a chair, writing of a chair, and the chair itself. And the reason why I referenced the chair was that when this piece was made, it was shown with the chair. It was shown with the chair in the show, and the chair was actually created and it was plated in 24 karat gold. And again, Alexis is talking about the materials, and I'm talking about the body and the experience. And I'm trying to talk about the barber chair or the experience of cutting your hair as a experiential process where one seeks to be a better version of themselves, and the barber chair being a space of learning and a portal of transformation. And that's why it was gold plated, because for me, the barber chair was very, very symbolic to me as a young person growing up, and to the community. And sitting in that chair was almost as if preparing for liftoff. So it was a really kind of important moment for me. And these are some of the things that I would do in people's hair, because I used to perform the cutting hair. So before I did the Duffy Conqueror piece, I was performing this thing called Life Salon, performing it at the Tate, where I'd cut visitors. And recently I did it in New Zealand, where I went and performed. I set up this barber shop in a small art space and just invited members from the public. And it's amazing, the conversations that take place, and you get a test of what the contemporary cultural consciousness is. And I always say, when I travel, 3 places I always go: taxis, I ask taxis 100 questions. I go to the bar, I ask them 100 questions. And I find a barber shop, I ask them 100 questions, because I can always know where to go, what to do, what to avoid by going to these 3 places. I think I'm on an hour, so I'm probably just gonna maybe just fly through these.
Just carry on, and then we'll ask questions at the end. It's all cool.
All right, so this is a solo show I did in the US 2015, and it's the start of my, what I call the squad project, where it's gonna go across 7 continents, and in each continent, I'm gonna find 11 people who are what they call common heroes. I'm gonna bring them together and do a series of portraits of them and incorporate their DNA into the work. So this was the first iteration of Squad, and it's 11 people that I found here in Madison. The images are probably, I don't know, 10 feet maybe tall. And the only thing that's changed in them is I changed the color of their eyes. And these are printed in Magnolia, and then they're mounted onto like an aluminium sheet. So they're huge objects. And I never forget, one of the security guards came to me and said, the eyes follow you around the room. So the person on the left in each picture has selected that person on the right as their equal. So each person on the left was asked to select a person who was an equal, or somebody that has contributed significantly to being what they call a common hero. And these are the images that came from that show. And the person on the right selected this person on the left. And each image had, they had their alter ego names. So the person on the right called himself Ramesses, because he did some research to work out that Ramesses had red hair. So he was looking at the idea of trying to, pull on the spirit of Ramesses to kind of help him pose in this work. And the one on the left is she was called the Phantom, and the one on the right was called Gilgamesh. And the reason why they were both selected was the one on the right, he went on to be to do painting at Yale, and he's doing extremely well. But he did a protest when I first came to Madison, where he hung a hoodie outside of the building to talk about the treatment of the black body in the US. And it was all over the papers, it was in the media, and nobody knew he had done it. And then when I was convening a curatorial group to bring the show together, we had one more person to put in the show, and they said, could we get Alex to be the last person because of his act of defiance in hanging that hoodie and getting a lot of criticism. So he was a person that was invited into the show, but each person had their own kind of story. And this was the youngest person, a young Native American kid. And he provides the doorway for the next squad piece that I'm doing. So he will be the reference that helps me reference the next squad piece. And I've already working on UK squad and squad in Egypt. And once I was doing the squad piece, I did some work with an LGBTQ in Scotland, a part of squad Scotland. And when I went to meet them, the day I arrived, I walked into the community center and they were all getting their hair cut. So what I did was I asked them, could I collect the hair? And I explained to them, I want to do a project based around their transformation. I want to work on a series of portraits. And what I did was I actually took their portraits on my Hasselblad and then printed their portrait in glue and then blended all of their hair with liquid nitrogen in a laboratory and then sprinkled it back onto the picture. So what you're seeing here are portraits made of it's all of their hair. So the 11 people in the show, what you see are images constructed by their own hair. And the interesting thing was that the hue of the hair, and I think painters would understand this, there were blonde hair, people with black hair, with brown hair, mousy blonde hair. And I cut it all together with the blade first, and then put it into the mortar and pestle, and we crushed it with liquid nitrogen to make it really, really fine. And then sprinkled it onto the screen printed, glued portraits of themselves to create these life-size portraits. And again, it's a project that I'm continuing to make, because your hair carries the information and the DNA of your ancestors. And whatever people do, whatever you try, whether you cut, blonde, shave, whatever you do to your head, the hair always wins. It comes back in its natural form. And I learned this because I did a project in 1993. I first did Life Salon when I left the Royal College, and I had it set up in the 198 Gallery in Brixton, and had a chair in the shop in the gallery. And this white lady came in to have what they call a half a key, which is the design around one side of the head, which you saw earlier. She had blonde hair. As I started cutting her hair with the scissors, and then I began to use the machine started to slow down. As the machine slowed down, I looked at her hair, and her hair was thick like mine. And I had to stop. There was a group of people around me, and I stopped and I said, what's going on here? She said that she had been relaxing her hair for her entire life because her great-grandfather came from, I think it was Zimbabwe, and the Life Salon event, she was able to shed all of that and have her hair cut off and have it exist in its natural state. And she felt that I was the right person to then create this pattern so she can live a new, authentic life. So for me, the idea of the hair always somehow coming back and winning is something that I was really curious of. And lastly, this is a show that is on Pitshanger Manor. It may still be open, and I'm supposed to be there cutting hair, but obviously I can't because of lockdown. So what you see is just a chair and a two-way mirror. And in that show, there are some new pieces that I'm working on. I'm working with tin types now. And basically, these are portraits of some of the objects, some of the tools that are used in this process. So I think I'm going to finish it there.
Faisal, thank you so much. I have actually quite a few questions here. Let me see where to start. So Susie, who would normally be on the panel with us, who is one of the organisers of Contribution. We had some technical difficulties earlier. Sorry, Susie, but you are with us in spirit. She says, what are your plans for the future projects? Do you have a dream project you'd like to realise?
Well, Susie, thank you for inviting me as well. I didn't realise if you were able to be on the call. I guess, yeah, I'm working on a dream project right now. I can't say too much because we're in the negotiation phase. I'm trying to speak with engineers and things like that. But yeah, one of them is something that I've had a real desire to do, and if it comes to fruition, I promise I will send you, Sam, and Emma the email. That I definitely promise. But that's definitely one that I'm working on. And also for me, in 2006, the Garden of Eden for me was a dream project, because for me, I'd never worked with you know, an object. David was just getting you know, a lot of attention then from his work. He was based in Shoreditch. He hadn't reached the levels that he'd reached now, but it was great to know that, you know, we had this idea of creating this object that my dealer couldn't sell. My dealer at the time would say, we can't sell this, so why are you making this? And that's something to be mindful of as young artists. You know, if you do a deal with the devil and you have a dealer, understand that you have to create things that they have to sell. And that's fine, because, you know, we have to get from A to B, but understand that there are a series of compromises. So the Garden of Eden was one that I really wanted to do. And also, actually, good question, it's the barber chair, because I had the idea for the chair for years. And I spoke to, you know, Mark Seeley, Dr. Mark Seeley at Autograph, and I said, look, Mark, I want to make this piece for the show, you know, Duffy Conqueror. And he said, what do you want to do? I said, I want to do a gold-plated chair. He went, hold on a second. And I'm talking to him on the phone. I'm like, what are you doing? He said, I'm looking to see if there's one in the world already. And, you know, it was that point that Mark was keen to see, does this thing already exist? So I think those three things are, I'd say, the Garden of Eden that I did. I think the chair and this current project that I can't really say, but yeah, just those three. And I think that's not a lot if you consider 20-something years of making work.
Thanks. We've got a question here from Amanda Francis again. It says here, you work with other technical experts like lots of other artists. Can you expand upon this relation, in particular ideas of authenticity of the artist's hand, which still prevails for some people?
Yeah, I think the idea of the hand is an age-old concept, isn't it? It's that we trust the hand. We trust the presence of the maker. And the only way that I can look at that is when I look at the Rake's Progress by Hogarth.
Yeah.
And I was looking at it, and I asked my colleague in the museum, can I see the Harlot's Progress? And he pulled those out as well. And I said to him that actually the Harlot's Progress, when you look at it under the microscope, it's crafted differently. He says, Faisal, those ones are done by the French engravers, and the Rake's Progress is done by the British engravers. And he says, which one do you like? And I said, oh, I think the Harlot's Progress has the edge. And the thing was, Hogarth didn't engrave it. So for me, I think that there is some, I think I am conscious of my hand and it kind of being present within the work, but I'm also conscious of, you know, the concept, the fact that, you know, is, architects don't build buildings. And for me, I don't, painters don't create the canvases. They're gonna, prime them, and then sometimes they have, assistants that will put on the first layer. So I do understand that we have to somehow teach our students to be proficient in a particular kind of discipline when they are studying. But also, I think we have to teach them also to be proficient in their thinking, so that they're able to, to create things that are done by people who have far more skills than them. Because, I would love to be able to craft in marble, but I can't do it. But the craft person doing the marble doesn't have the concept that I have for it to come into existence. So do I deny myself that by saying that because I'm going to train myself for 35 years to then make this piece? So I think there's a level of urgency in me. I know that I'm only here for a short period of time, like most of us. And I think for me, it's important from that moment when I was 11 years old, I went into the National Portrait Gallery and I didn't see a level of representation, and I'm in a hurry. And there's a level of urgency about that. So if I can be here and have 4 or 5 different things happening, I can have my tapestries being made in Belgium. I've got, the prints being made in Oakland, California. I've got some other things being crafted, in Madison, and some things being done in the UK. I'm working with a guy called Eric Bales with the tintypes. I do not have the bandwidth to, to do all of that studying to make those things myself. So this slideshow will be completely different. This slideshow will probably have 7 things in it. And you'll be like, oh, that's interesting. But because I'm able to work with, a number of different people in the field who are much better than me, I think I can think and make a much greater pace. So in some ways I'm agreeing, in another way I'm disagreeing, but I think there are pros and cons in working collaboratively.
Hi, Faisal, it's Samuel here.
Hi, Sam.
Thanks a lot for your talk today. It's been absolutely brilliant. Also, I think that I really appreciate, I think that everybody will actually, the amount of modesty that comes out of your mouth. I just wanted to ask a couple of questions before going back to Emma, because we have got more.
Oh, okay.
Very popular lecture, actually.
Oh, sorry.
The modesty is gone.
The modesty has gone.
No, I am apologizing here, because I know people they're busy, and it's
Oh, no. There's more questions come through, so it's just been super popular. So there's like lots of coming through.
I mean, in the first instance, we actually missed the part when you were speaking about the objects that went to the V&A, and it sounded like an interesting first engagement with I suppose a very, very established museum. And sure. I think that would be quite good for the students, well, for us all to hear, actually, once again.
You talk about the logistics of it?
No, so basically when you were talking, the feed went out a little bit. So we didn't hear what the process was from 3 weeks that you'd made the work to it being at the V&A.
Oh, okay. So what the work was about?
So we don't know what you said.
Basically, anything that you said in that part, we missed about 2 minutes.
Oh, sorry. All right. So the Thalatha Haq was a piece that was based on my journey into Islam, and I would say that I'm a different person now. So when I was 23, I embraced Islam then as a way of trying to find myself, I guess, and created Thalatha Haq, which was screen printed onto glass, and it was 19 inches in dimension because I was numerically superstitious about the number 19, and it was this idea that it plays with the assumptions of faith and the unseen. Talks about my fragility in embracing this new name, this new kind of identity. I'm in 3 positions of prayer, and it was photographed whilst I was in Spain by one of my colleagues at the RCA, 5. I haven't seen or heard from Fine in a while. I had to get him up at 5 in the morning to take the photograph. And for me, it was just looking at the idea of my spiritual ascension, and thinking about the pyramid as being the first temple of worship and practice. So, that's how that piece kind of came into kind of existence. And one thing I want to add to that was, when I showed that piece in the US, the students asked me, "Oh, did you sell the piece?" I said, "Yes." And I said, and they asked me, "What did you sell it for, Professor?" And I said, "I don't know. I think it was about £500 at the time." And they went, "No, you can't sell it for that. That was cheap, to a museum." And they were, everyone was like, arguing and saying that, I should never have done it. And I says, "Well, how much would you sell your painting for?" And they all gave me some figure, like $2,000, $3,000. And I says, "Are you in any collections?" And they said, "No." I said, "Are you in any private collections?" And they said, "No." So I says, "Why would I buy a painting of somebody who is not in any collection and you're valuing your work at $2,000? And they were kind of quiet. So I said, "I sold that work for £500. And I said to them, 10 years later, or 7 years later, I had a dealer. And then my dealer was selling one of my Last Supper photographs. And they said to this collector in Belgium, we're selling this picture, this is what it costs." And the person in Belgium went, "Never heard of him. How can you charge us that kind of money?" And my dealer went, "Well, he's got a piece in the V&A museum." And the dealer was like, "Okay, done." So again, what I will say to you is that, don't think about, the bigger, what they call it, penny wise and pound wise, or penny foolish, or penny foolish, pound wise. Think about, if somebody wants to acquire your work into a collection, you're not paying a large amount of money, that's something that will pay you dividends further down the road. So always think about that in terms of your work.
Yeah, good point.
Shall I return to the
Yeah,
questions?
please.
Okay.
I'll ask
So Faisal, the anonymous person who asked you about if they could steal your yeah, they said, "Any chance of a haircut when you're next on campus?" Christy Taylor, Fine Art BA.
All right. So providing I can get on a plane, and if I'm in London, again, I will email Emma, let them know, and I'm more than happy to do some kind of performance.
Okay, it's a deal. All right. So Sharon, your long-time colleague, great artist.
Oh, great person.
Exactly. So she's saying, "Dearest Faisal, greetings. How do you feel your work is read in the US? How is it different from reading in the UK?"
That's something that I'm still learning, and I always say, I just try and be as honest when I'm trying to answer a question, and I can honestly say I don't really have the answer yet, because I don't think I've been there long enough. I think for me, 7 years here, I think I'm still in my kind of early phases. I do understand though that the way in which they try to understand the work through the lens of race, and I have to say, hold on a second, there are other factors here. There's material, there's kind of science, there's humor, there's looking at issues of the multiple, there's other things that all human beings are fascinated with, and my world isn't necessarily through the lens of this one thing. So I've had to somehow kind of educate them on the way in which on the way in which I see and think. So I think I'm something that I'm still trying to kind of work out. I think there are lots of kind of opportunities because people are just curious, because they assume that I am this, and then when I open my mouth, he's this. So for me, it's interesting that I think we're having this dance at the moment. And I probably will know, I think, at the mark of 10. So I think in 10 years, 3 years time, if I'm still in the US, I think I'll know then how they're taking to the work. I have to say, for now, I think the reception has been pretty good. I think they have really I think for them, their reason is through curiosity, that they want to have this other conversation in the space. Because I do bring a different understanding, given my own history, because I come with a different lens. I mean, if you think about that, there's a moment in that Netflix documentary on They Got to Have Us, where they critique British actors going to the US and playing American roles, in particular African American roles. And one of the directors was saying that David Oluwami playing Martin Luther King, they're not sure if he's able to do authentically because of him understanding and feeling the history. And then you have Delroy Lindo saying, actually, I disagree, because it's actually, does that person do a good job in being the authentic person? So as you can see at the moment, there's a bit of a kind of standoff, to add on to your question, Sharon, also in how that community is receiving me, you know, and in some ways that community can be sometimes negative in terms of they can just decide not to have a discussion or bring me into the room. And on other levels, you know, they can invite you in with open arms because of curiosity.
Thanks, Faisal. I've got another question here from Anonymous, but I think it's a different Anonymous. Can you give your perspective on the agency of art, its effect on the world and people?
I think for me, it's in the earlier slide, right? I showed those images of Dove and the images of the blackface, the images of Benetton. I think, you know, I think all of you, every single person on this call, every single person that has been fortunate to have an arts education, anyone who has not and creates things, have all contributed to the way in which society receives and how society thinks. And there's a responsibility with that. And that's why, you know, when I create the work, you know, Adiv or Goldfinger or Round Mute or Squad, you know, I'm really, really mindful. I don't always get it right, but I'm very, very mindful of how that form, subject, is going to be mediated and kind of understood. You know, I'm not here to tick a box to say, I'm going to tick all these boxes to have this work that is everybody, but I do think that I can only open windows and let people into different aspects of our existence and try to look at the complexity of that and to celebrate that complexity with materials as well. So I think that's the only way that I could. And the second part of the question again was?
Sorry, and it says, and the effect in the world and people.
Yeah, so that's what I can say. I think, you know, it's had a profound effect. And if you think about the earliest form of social media, Facebook, that drew, you know, I would say painting drew a line. Painting and sculpture drew a line under, you know, how a lot of this stuff played out in how we begin to build these kind of ideas around people. And we think about those early photographs done through anthropology, where they would go out and have these people standing naked and measuring their neck and their head. You know, those things are still with us, you know. And that's why when I look at those Victorian images of the Black Chronicles, it's such another view that it's almost like there was another event taking place that is chronicling, you know, the body in a very beautiful and tender way. And there was other ways in which the body was being, you know, mediated as the noble savage. And how has that impacted on how we see and describe it? And it still happens. If you look at soccer or football, describe, I'll remember his name in a second, but most of the strong, what they call quick Black footballers, they always call them a beast. Oh, he's a beast. But the strong, big white players, they just say that they are strong. So people don't realize how the very small micro expressions that are fed into, you know, our consciousness, they still exist today, and they're based purely on some of those early representations. So we are all responsible. And I think, we should make sure that when we create and we leave that indelible index, we do it with some kind of responsibility.
Thank you so much, Faisal. You had more questions, didn't you, Sam?
No, thank you, Faisal, once again. I've taken a hell of a lot of interest of what you've been saying throughout the whole course of this talk. I suppose the projects which I've most taken interest in being a sculptor are the more immersive ones. And I had never approached any of your artworks before in person, so when doing the research that I have done in the past on what you do, there's obviously not that sort of sense of the smell, this nostalgic smell of a morgue, or cooling the room down to a temperature which then graces that appreciation of that type of space, which I think is an absolutely fantastic way to describe to an audience something which you have felt yourself. I was just wondering, really, with regards to future projects, are you thinking of bringing that more so once again into the development of your visual language, or is that something that you've left behind?
Great question, Sam. I mean, for me, I think nothing gets left behind. I think what happens is there's a printmaker called Delita Martin, and she does these amazing drawings. And what she does is she does this amazing drawing from memory, and then she leaves and then comes back to the studio the following day. And then she says, the drawing speaks to her. The drawing says, my name is such and such. And that's how the title is born, and then she works it into a multicolored print. And I just think that, I didn't choose printmaking chose me. I don't kind of choose or select ways of working. I think something happens in my own life that requires me to then create this space that is sensorially. And then there's another requirement, and then there's another requirement. And there are times when there needs to be no interaction with the senses at all, purely visual. And there are times where there needs to be no interaction or no making from me, and work with the community. So here I work with the community in Camberwell, and and there's a lot of work that I do through social practice. I work with young kids who've been in trouble with the police, and they help augment the work. So for me, there isn't phases and where things get left behind. I think things just kind of come back. So when I think about Adiv, that circle, and I think about Goldfinger, and then I think about the notion of light within the work, and I think about the absence of kind of light in kind of heads of state, and then and I think about the idea of things being the idea of permanence, the idea of semi-permanence, the idea that some works can never ever physically exist other than you being present to see that piece, like in the heads of state where it's scraped away. Mm-hmm. So I'm always just thinking about the way in which kind of I exist, and the way in which I think, and the way in which I can somehow invest that into the work as if it was something talismanic. So when I think about some of the buildings that they created in mud in North Africa, before they could complete them, they stick amulets into the mud to protect the building, like a prayer or something, or they pour milk into the building to feed it, so it almost like activates it. So I kind of see the works that I'm creating are these things where these things that are activated for a period of time, and then maybe something else happens. So my hope is that the thought is always there, mm-hmm. but it kind of exists in different strengths.
Sure. No, that's really interesting. And it's for me, when I'm, I suppose, looking into your practice, especially for this talk, I've been looking at them as almost each individual project as a petri dish of sorts. Mm-hmm. So what you've done there for me is you've really connected those different petri dishes, yeah, to make it a very kind of clinical overview with a great amount of perspective, actually. So thank you ever so much.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
I think thank you very much. I think the resounding kind of feedback is amazing from the feed that's come here, and thank you for giving us your time. I think the talk's been really brilliant, really informative. So Susie has said, "You rock, Faisal," at the end. That's the final
Thank you.
comment. Is there anything you would like to leave us with this evening?
No, I mean, I just think I think be kind to each other.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult time. I think, you know, as artists, you are a generation that has never experienced this. And 20 years from now, people are going to be sitting in a bar and saying, there was this thing called COVID, man, and I don't know how people dealt with it. And you're going to be sitting there as the person who probably might be the same age as me or 40 odd years old and saying, well, I actually worked through that. And I would encourage you all to make real, you know, robust records, not digitally. Write things into your, you know, on piece of paper. Write things into the sketchbook. You know, photograph things with, you know, physical analog film. Make robust records because, you know, when this passes, you know, I think when we get to the other side, you're going to have some really amazing content that, you know, will be of help to the next generation. And I would just encourage you all just to be brave, embrace uncertainty, and just try to create, you know, the conditions for excellence to thrive. That's what I would say.
Faisal, thank you so much.
The pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. Missed you, my friend.
Yeah, likewise. And it's great to hear all of my friends are still there. You know, Sharon, Amanda, you know, everyone's still there. It's Grenville, they're great people. So, and Alexis. So I would just say, you know, just keep doing what you do. And hopefully I'll be back to do something for you. It'd be great.
We're sending you big thanks and big love from the other side of the Atlantic. And kisses.
Thank you. Take care.
Ciao, ciao. See you later.
Bye-bye.